Chapter 1. Just the Wife. She's just the wife. She sits in on meetings sometimes, but let's be clear about whose name is actually on this company. My husband said it to our entire board, gesturing toward me with the easy confidence of a man introducing a piece of furniture 3 weeks before our biggest acquisition offer yet. I sat there in my usual seat at the far end of the table, coffee cooling in front of me, and said nothing. What David didn't know, what none of the 12 people in that room knew, was the product they were about to value at $40 million existed legally and on paper because of a patent filed 9 years earlier under my name alone. Welcome back to the channel. This one takes its time, the way the best ones always do, so stay with it. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and I was 41 years old the week my husband dismissed me in front of our own board, the same week our company's most valuable asset turned out to belong entirely and unambiguously to me. To understand how that happened, you have to go back 9 years to a converted garage in our old house and a marriage that started out as an actual partnership before it quietly became something else. David and I met in graduate school, both mechanical engineering students with more ambition than money, and for the first few years of our marriage, that shared ambition was the thing that held us together. I was the one who noticed the gap in the market, a modular filtration system for industrial water treatment that could cut installation costs in half, sketching the first prototype designs on the back of grocery receipts because we couldn't afford proper notebooks yet. David helped me build the first working model in our garage, contributed real engineering insight to the mechanical housing, and together we filed for incorporation under the name Whitfield Dynamics. But somewhere in the years that followed, as the company grew from 2 people in a garage to a workforce of 60 engineers and a real office building downtown, the story of who had actually invented the core technology started shifting, slowly, almost without either of us noticing at first. David was naturally more comfortable in rooms full of investors, charismatic, quick with numbers, good at telling a story that made people want to write checks. I was better in the lab, better with the actual mechanics of the filtration system, better, frankly, at the part of the business that required patience most people didn't have. It made sense at first for him to become the public face of the company while I focused on engineering. It made less sense over time that the public face slowly became the entire story. By our 5th year in business, investor pitch decks referred to David as the founder and inventor of Whitfield's patented filtration technology, with my name appearing, if at all, in a small line under engineering team. Reporters who wrote about our early growth quoted David extensively about his vision for solving industrial water waste, and I would lead those articles at our kitchen table, coffee going cold, saying nothing, telling myself it didn't matter as long as the company succeeded. I told myself that a lot, actually, in those years. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. Some part of me almost believed it. What David never seemed to remember, or perhaps chose not to remember, was the actual paperwork from those early years. When we'd filed the original patent application 9 years earlier, our patent attorney had insisted on listing inventorship precisely according to who had actually conceived and reduced the core innovation to practice, regardless of how the company's marketing might later choose to tell the story. I remembered sitting in that attorney's office, exhausted, 8 months pregnant with our first child, signing my name to a document that listed me as sole inventor of the modular filtration mechanism, while David's name appeared correctly and separately on 2 supporting utility patents for peripheral housing components he genuinely contributed. It was accurate. It was also, I would learn 9 years later, something David had entirely stopped mentioning to anyone, including, apparently, himself. I don't think I fully understood in the moment he called me just the wife in that board meeting exactly how much that single sentence would end up costing him. I just knew, sitting there with my coffee going cold for what felt like the 1,000th time in 9 years, that something in me had finally, quietly stopped being willing to let the story stay as comfortable and inaccurate as it had become. Looking back now, I think that board meeting was the moment two entirely separate versions of our marriage finally collided in front of witnesses. The wife David had quietly rewritten into a footnote, and the engineer whose signature had been sitting, legally binding and unambiguous, on the very foundation of everything he was busy taking credit for. For years afterwards, whenever a colleague asked me why I'd never corrected David directly in front of investors, I found myself returning to the same answer, because correcting him too early, too publicly, felt like it would cost the company more than the silence did. I told myself the paperwork would always be there if it ever truly mattered. I didn't expect it to matter this much, this suddenly, in a room of people who'd already made up their minds about who deserved the credit. Chapter 2. The Acquisition Talks. The acquisition talks moved quickly after that board meeting, the way these things tend to once serious money enters a room. A larger industrial conglomerate had made an offer to acquire Whitfield Dynamics outright, valuing the company primarily on the strength of our patented filtration technology, and David threw himself into the negotiations with the particular energy he reserved for moments when he was, in his mind, about to be recognized for something significant. He gave interviews. He met with the acquiring company's executives over dinners I wasn't invited to, though I was technically still chief engineering officer and co-founder on every piece of internal documentation that mattered. I didn't say anything to him directly about the board meeting comment, not because I'd forgiven it, but because I'd learned, over 9 years, that confronting David directly rarely produced anything except a longer, more elaborate version of the same dismissal, delivered with wounded confusion at why I was making something out of nothing. Instead, I did what I'd always done when something bothered me enough to actually act on it. I went back to the actual paperwork, quietly, and I made sure I understood exactly what it said. It said what I remembered it saying. I was the sole named inventor on the original patent application covering the core modular filtration mechanism, the technology the acquiring company was valuing the entire deal around. David's name appeared accurately on 2 secondary patents covering housing components that mattered, but that weren't on their own worth anywhere near what the core mechanism was worth. I sat with that confirmation for a long time in my home office one evening, feeling something that wasn't quite vindication and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. There were nights during those weeks when I nearly said something anyway, when watching David rehearse his talking points for investor calls about his invention felt heavier than any silence I'd carried before. Once, helping him prepare slides for a pitch deck, I found myself staring at a slide crediting founder vision for the filtration breakthrough and simply closing my laptop instead of correcting it, telling myself, the way I always did, that the acquisition mattered more than the argument would. The tension in our marriage, which had been quietly building for years under the surface of shared parenting and shared mortgage payments, started surfacing in smaller, sharper ways during that period. David mentioned, almost as an aside at dinner, that the acquiring company's due diligence team would want to speak with the founding team, and added, without quite looking at me, that he'd handle most of those conversations himself, since he understood the bigger picture better than the technical details would allow me to convey persuasively. I told him honestly that I thought I could convey the technical details just fine. He laughed, the particular laugh he used when he thought he was being kind about something that wasn't actually kind at all. I began paying closer attention to the due diligence process after that, not to interfere, but because some quiet instinct told me the acquiring company's legal team would eventually need to review the actual patent filings directly, rather than simply accepting whatever narrative had been circulating in press releases and pitch decks for years. When David mentioned the deal's final phase would include a comprehensive intellectual property audit, standard for any acquisition of this size, I understood that the story he'd been telling for 9 years was about to meet a set of lawyers whose entire job was verifying exactly the kind of detail he'd apparently forgotten mattered. It was our company's general counsel, actually, who first flagged the discrepancy to me directly, calling one afternoon with a note of careful professionalism in her voice. "Sarah, I'm reviewing the IP portfolio ahead of the audit, and I want to confirm something with you before it goes to the acquiring company's legal team. The core patent, the modular filtration mechanism, that's filed solely on your name, correct?" I told her yes, that it had always been correct, and that David simply hadn't corrected the public narrative around it recently. She was quiet for a moment. "He's been telling the board and the press it's his invention," she said carefully. "I just want to make sure I present the actual filing accurately in the audit materials." I told her yes, please present it exactly as it was actually filed, not as anyone had chosen to tell it since. There were evenings during those weeks when I found myself standing in our garage, now converted into storage, staring at the workbench where I'd built that first prototype, trying to remember exactly when the story had slipping away from accuracy. I couldn't pinpoint a single moment. It had happened gradually, the way most quiet erasures do. One investor pitch and one magazine profile at a time, until 9 years had passed and an entire company's public history no longer matched its actual paperwork. Our general counsel later told me she'd noticed the discrepancy in David's public statements more than once over the years and had simply assumed, the way most people around us apparently had, that I was comfortable with the arrangement since I'd never once corrected it myself in any meeting she'd witnessed. Chapter 3. The Due Diligence Meeting. The due diligence meeting was scheduled on a Tuesday morning at the acquiring company's downtown offices, a comprehensive review that would bring together their legal team, our general counsel, David, and at my own insistence for the first time in years, me directly, in my actual capacity as Chief Engineering Officer and named inventor, rather than an optional spouse who might attend if convenient. David seemed mildly surprised when I told him I intended to be present for the full session, though not suspicious, the way a man isn't suspicious of something he's never once considered might be a problem. I could have let the audit simply proceed on paper, letting the acquiring company's lawyers quietly discover the actual inventorship structure through documents alone, without ever needing to be in the room when David's understanding of 9 years finally met the version that had been legally true the entire time. Part of me seriously considered that option, the version of this where David learned the truth through a formal letter rather than my own presence across a conference table. But I kept thinking about every pitch deck slide, every reporter's quote, every dinner where I'd closed my laptop instead of saying something. I wanted to be there, not for cruelty, for clarity. We sat down that morning across from the acquiring company's senior IP attorney, a woman with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who could clearly done this exact review hundreds of times before. She pulled up the original patent filing on the screen between us, the one from 9 years earlier, and read the inventorship section aloud, the way lawyers do when they want absolute clarity on the record. The modular filtration mechanism, patent number 8 something something, sole named inventor, Sarah Whitfield. She looked up. Mr. Whitfield, I want to confirm you're aware of this filing structure, since our valuation of the core technology is built substantially around this specific patent. David's expression shifted slowly, confusion arriving before recognition did, the particular look of a man recalculating 9 years of a story in real time. We filed that together, as a company, he said, glancing toward me with something between appeal and accusation. I'm listed on the housing component patents, I said quietly, keeping my voice as level as I would have in any technical review. You are. Those are real, and they're yours. But the core mechanism, the thing this entire valuation is actually built around, that's always been mine alone. It has been since the day we filed it, 8 months pregnant, in an attorney's office you were also sitting in. The room went very still, in the way rooms go still when a story that's been repeated confidently for years suddenly meets a document that was true the entire time. You, David said finally, quieter than I'd heard him speak in years, more to himself than to me. The whole time it was actually yours. I didn't lay out every pitch deck slide, every reporter's quote, every time he'd introduced me as the wife instead of his co-founder, though some old, tired part of me wanted to. I simply confirmed the filing details for the attorney, calmly, professionally, the way I would explain a technical specification to anyone in the room, because the acquisition needed accurate information to proceed, regardless of what it revealed about 9 years of a marriage built quietly around an inaccurate story. It was only after the acquiring company's team stepped out to caucus privately, leaving David and me alone at that conference table for the first time in longer than I could remember, that he asked the question I'd been expecting for years, though I hadn't expected it to actually arrive in a conference room instead of our kitchen. Why didn't you ever correct me? All those years, all those pitches, why let me say it? Because I told myself it didn't matter, as long as the company succeeded. I was wrong about that. It mattered. It just took the actual paperwork existing to finally make it impossible for either of us to keep pretending otherwise. He didn't answer that right away. He just sat there for a long moment, looking at the patent number still displayed on the screen, the one he'd apparently never actually read closely in 9 years of introducing himself as its inventor. Driving to that meeting that morning, I kept thinking about every version of this conversation I'd imagined over the years, some angrier, a few uncomfortably satisfying in ways I wasn't proud of. None of them looked like what actually happened. A quiet conference room, a patient attorney reading a patent number aloud, and David's face slowly working through 9 years of a story, meeting the paperwork that had always contradicted it. Whatever came next needed to be steadier than anything I'd rehearsed. Not a performance, just the truth, delivered the same way I'd explain any technical specification, regardless of who happened to be sitting across from me. Our general counsel told me afterwards that she'd seen this exact dynamic before in other companies she'd audited. A spouse quietly holding the actual intellectual property, while a more outspoken partner built an entire public identity around a version of events the paperwork had never actually supported. She said it gently, almost kindly, like she understood exactly how long 9 years of silence could stretch before a single conference room finally interrupted it. Chapter 4. The Grocery Receipt. The weeks after that due diligence meeting were harder than I expected, in a way that had less to do with the acquisition itself and more with what happens inside a marriage when 9 years of a comfortable story finally meets 9 years of an accurate one. David didn't apologize right away, and honestly, I hadn't expected him to. Men who've spent nearly a decade believing their own version of events don't often arrive at a different one on anyone's schedule but their own, and I'd made peace with that possibility long before that conference table conversation ended. What surprised me was how quiet he became at home, in a way that felt less like anger and more like a man slowly running out of the story he'd told himself, our investors, and our own board for years. He stopped mentioning the acquisition entirely at dinner for almost 2 weeks, and I noticed him more than once sitting alone in his home office late at night, the light on long after I'd gone to bed. It was our daughter, actually, 12 years old and sharper than either of us usually gave her credit for, who told me what she'd overheard one evening, sitting on the stairs while David spoke quietly on the phone with his own father. He said he'd been telling the story wrong for years, she said, half confused, half curious about why it mattered so much to her parents. He said something about Mom actually inventing the thing. I didn't know what to do with that information at first. I'd spent weeks bracing for either an explosive argument or an explosive apology, and instead I got something quieter and much harder to name, a man beginning, slowly and privately, to reckon with nearly a decade of a narrative built around his own comfort. The real shift came a month later at the acquisition's official closing dinner, a small gathering of the acquiring company's executives, our legal teams, and both of us, marking the finalization of the deal at a value that had, in the end, been substantially confirmed by the very patent David had spent years failing to properly credit. He stood to give brief remarks, the kind he'd given at a dozen similar events over the years, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't center himself in the story. This technology exists because of an idea my wife had in our garage 9 years ago, sketched on the back of a grocery receipt because we couldn't afford a proper notebook, he said, his voice steadier than I expected. I should have said that a long time before tonight. I'm saying it now, and I mean it. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not into forgiveness exactly, not yet, but into something that at least resembled the beginning of it. He came to my home office privately the following week, the first time in years he'd actually stepped into the space where I did most of my real engineering work, rather than treating it as a room he passed on his way elsewhere. He sat across from my desk, and he said the words plainly, without performance. "I'm sorry, Sarah, not just for the board meeting, for 9 years of a story I let myself believe because it was easier than the true one." I didn't need him to elaborate further, and I didn't ask him to. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, though I also told him something I needed him to hear as much as the apology itself, that our marriage surviving this wasn't going to depend on one dinner speech, no matter how sincere, but on whether the correction actually held once the acquisition dust settled and no lawyers were left in the room to enforce accuracy. We didn't fix everything overnight. Some habits built over 9 years don't unwind in a single conversation, no matter how sincere. But something did change permanently. He started introducing me correctly at industry events, unprompted, without needing a due diligence team to require it of him. He asked about my engineering work, genuinely, the way he used to back in the garage, before the story got away from both of us. I still keep that original grocery receipt, the one with my first filtration sketches on the back, framed now in my home office beside the actual patent certificate.
I don't need him to say the words "I was wrong" in every room we walk into for the rest of our marriage. Watching him become someone slightly more honest, slightly more careful with credit, slightly more like the partner who helped me build that first prototype in our garage, that turned out to be enough to start again on, if it wasn't, and never would be, quite the same as where we started. I think about that closing dinner often now, not because it resolved everything between us. It didn't, not fully, not in the tidy way these stories like to promise, but because it was the first time in 9 years that being reduced to just the wife felt less like an old wound and more like something that had finally, undeniably, met its correction in front of the exact people who'd been repeating the inaccurate version for years. And maybe that's the part worth holding on to, that patience isn't the same as invisibility, and that the truth, once it's actually on paper, doesn't need permission from anyone's comfort to eventually be spoken aloud. A close friend asked me once, months after that dinner, whether I regretted the 9 years of silence. I told her the truth. I regretted every pitch deck slide and every magazine quote, but never the actual decision to keep building quietly in the lab instead of fighting for credit in every room we walked into. The silence had never really been about protecting David's ego. It had been about believing for far too long that the work itself would eventually speak clearly enough on its own.